Well, December 10, 1930, fairly ordinary Wednesday morning by all accounts, when a New York merchant walks into his bank and says, "I want to withdraw all of my stock." The teller responds, "No, I'm not going to do that. This bank is a sound and a safe investment. Why would you want to withdraw all of your stock?" Not happy with the response, he goes back to his workplace and says to his colleagues, "I think that bank must be in trouble." Within a few hours, hundreds of people have turned up at the branch there on Freeman Street in the Bronx, demanding their cash as well. By 8 p.m, 20,000 people have turned up. $2 million has been withdrawn from the branch across the course of the day, including one man who queued for 2 hours just to withdraw a measly $2 from his account. The rumour, it spreads to branches across the nation, and that evening the Bank of the United States closes its doors and never opens again. All because of one person and everyone going along with him. I think one of the great defining features that we say of the time we live in, the age we live in, is individualism. You know, I am my own person, I choose my own destiny. But how true is that really? When you start to dig a little bit deeper, study after study after study would suggest that it's actually a great myth. That rather than being the great individuals that we might think we are, in fact, we're people with a great propensity to conformity, following those who are around us. Everything from what we wear to how we think, what we believe, even the emotions that we might feel can be shaped by those who are around us. Even not just what we eat, but how we eat. In one study, dozens of pairs of women eating together were observed. And the study found 3,888 mouthfuls later, not only how much each woman ate depended on how much her companion ate, but that each couple's eating was highly coordinated. In other words, the women were more likely to put fork to mouth simultaneously than separately, particularly at the beginning of the meal. Every mouthful you take from now on, you'll be thinking about perhaps. Of course, this propensity to conform can be taken advantage of. The UK government is onto it. It's this kind of thinking that's behind their so-called nudge strategy. A strategy designed to recoup unpaid income tax. It's fairly simple, not rocket science. What they do is they send a letter to those who haven't paid up on time with a bit of a waggle of the finger saying, everyone else is doing it. As a result, tax compliance increased by some 20%. With a simple letter just saying, everyone else is doing it except you. There's a book called The Power of Others, which documents the extent to which we're shaped by those around us, the extent to which we conform. And the author concludes, it feels like we're in the driving seat in our daily lives, making decisions autonomously, experiencing emotions that we ourselves generate, choosing what we believe in and what we don't. Mostly, this is an illusion. Conformity is a dominant force in our world today. It's a pressure that all people feel. But for Christians, that pressure takes on an added feature at times, and that is the pressure to conform to values which don't necessarily align with our faith. Especially the values which might often at times drive and shape our organisations, our industries, the market that we're working with. And at times the pressure to go along with those, the pressure to conform can feel almost inescapable. Working as a radio journalist, that was my background. Our industry had the tendency to simply, first thing in the morning, copy what the newspapers were reporting, oftentimes without really too much attribution. No credit really given to the journalists who had done the work. And I remember on one occasion pushing back, asking, should we really be doing like this? And the puzzled looks that I received and the scratches of the head. And the response really was, well, that's just kind of how the industry works. And so the pressure to conform at that moment was real. That's just how our industry operates. Why would you ask a question about it? And yet the New Testament contains that instruction that Rob just read for us. Do not conform to the pattern of this world. Don't conform to the values, the morals, the ethics which don't align with Christ. Christians, at times, in occasions, will need to be non-conformists. So I want to take a moment just to consider those couple of verses from Romans, particularly verse 2, and hopefully provide some way for us to think about how to handle the pressure to conform. The verses, they begin there with the words, therefore in view of God's mercy. What Paul is about to say is in light of God's mercy, all that he has spent the 11 chapters preceding talking about, the extravagant grace that's been shown to us in Christ. And so Paul says, in view of that mercy, the mercies of God, God now has a claim over your life. You are his. All that you do with your body, all that you do with your mind is to be shaped by him and given over to him, to his better way of living, a way of living that it says there in verse 2, which is good and pleasing and perfect. But a way that nevertheless is oftentimes profoundly at odds with the world and the culture around us. A way which might at times often be a way of non-conformity. The way of non-conformity has always been a feature of the people of God. In the Old Testament, a repeated refrain is, you must not do as they do. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, do not be like them. And then the Apostle Paul here in Romans picks it up and continues on that theme with the words, do not conform. The way of the people of God is very often a way of non-conformity. It's why the Christian theologian Karl Barth called Christian ethics the great disturbance. That very often at times we might need to go against the grain of the world around us. So Romans says we are people who are not to conform, but instead it says to be transformed. The word that's translated transformed there in verse 2, it only occurs two other places in the New Testament. In one, it's in Mark's Gospel, and it's the word that is used to describe what happens to Jesus at his transfiguration, where a complete change comes over him. His skin, his face, his clothing shone completely transformed. But the second place it is used is not of Jesus, but his followers in 2 Corinthians 3:18. 2 Corinthians 3:18, where we read, and we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image. And so the point of these couple of verses is simply this. We're not to conform to the patterns, the ethics, the values of the world around us. But we are to become like someone else. That propensity to conformity that we have is to be channeled towards becoming more like Jesus. Because is not Jesus the great non-conformist? In a culture that said you eat meals with people in order to get ahead, he goes and eats meals with tax collectors, prostitutes, sinners. In a culture that said the religious leader's there to go unchallenged, he instead calls out their hypocrisy time and time again. And in spite of his incredible power, which should have seen him seated on a throne, you instead find him on his knees, washing people's feet. Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed, become more and more like the greatest non-conformist, Jesus Christ, and his better way of living, a way which it really is good, pleasing and perfect, but a way which is nevertheless hard. I don't want to be naive to the very real pressure that we face to conform. The pressure that others exert on us is real. To push back, it can be costly. It really can be costly. When you're the only junior employee not supporting the latest cause in your office that month because it's profoundly at odds with your faith, or you're the only senior manager in your firm or your particular industry who's asking questions about the labour markets that your industry uses, which they are legal, but are they good, pleasing and perfect? So it can be hard. We need help in this, don't we? Not just to have the courage to not conform, because it takes great courage, but also to know, when do I push back and what should it look like? How? When and how? Because non-conformity is not a license to be a jerk in the office. Constantly adversarial, aggressive, stubborn. Non-conformity can be profoundly subtle like washing feet when you're entitled to a corner office. So let me give two suggestions to aid our non-conformity. Firstly, a framework, and I've shared this before, some of you might have heard it, but a framework that I think is particularly helpful in considering how and when we push back. And it comes from a book by Andrew Cameron called Joined Up Life, and he suggests that in the New Testament there are 4 postures that Christians are to have towards the world. Posture number 1, and this is the starting point, is cooperation. Romans 12:18. If it's possible, so far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. That's to be the starting point in the workplace. In every workplace there is mess. In every organisation there is sin, there's flaws, there's faults. Our aim is to do as much real good as possible in spite of that, in the midst of that. So the teacher whose school is driven by commercial interests, who nevertheless works hard at keeping his focus on educating young minds. Or the lawyer whose firm is driven by just increasing client numbers. Nevertheless, she resolves to slow down enough to still treat those people, not just as another client, but as a real person who has come to that firm at a time of difficulty and need in their life. 1 is cooperation, 2 is subversion. This is an act which challenges the politics of the organisation that you work for. It makes people stop and question, well, why do we do it like that? It's an act like Jesus eating meals with sinners or washing the feet of his disciples. I remember the first time seeing my Christian boss put himself onto the worst shift on our roster. The 3:30 a.m. start on a Saturday morning. Those are the shifts he always did when you first started working at the place. So what on earth was my boss rostering himself on that shift for? It was an act of subversion. It was an act of non-conformity, saying I won't be bound by what our industry says about how bosses should behave and perform. It was an act of humbling himself, making himself nothing, taking on the form of a servant. And everyone in our newsroom noticed his name there on the worst shift on the roster. So let me really challenge you at this point of subversion. I think it's here that you can have the most powerful witness for the gospel in your office. Elsewhere I've given the example of saying sorry as being an act of subversion. If the politics of your workplace is to never admit fault, and into that you step and you say, I'm sorry. I take the rap and I'm going to make amends and sort out whatever problem has been made. If you do an act like that, that's an act of subversion. It challenges the politics. It's an act of non-conformity. So let me encourage you to get really creative here particularly. You know the issues of your industry are better than me and better than others here. So get creative here. What are the ethical compromises or selfish practices that exist in your industry, in your organisation, at your firm, that you could challenge with an act of non-conformity? Not necessarily by calling it out as such with your words, but by an act of subversion. What are the ethical compromises or selfish practices that exist in your industry that you could challenge with an act of subversion? Posture number 3 is exposure. Ephesians chapter 5 verse 11, Ephesians 5:11 have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. I do think that the bulk of our non-conformity, day in, day out, week in, week out, might be more through acts of subversion. Nevertheless, there may come a time such as this, to use the words from the book of Esther, where, like Esther, God has placed you in a particular organisation, in a particular role, to call out and point out darkness that might exist there, at a potential cost to yourself. The advertising executive who says, no, we're going to draw the line there and we will not promote that, even though it comes at a cost to our agency and to me as the director ultimately. There we will draw the line. The medical researcher who pushes back and challenges excesses in biomedicine at a potential risk of being alienated by the medical community, by the research community. Tim Keller, in his book Every Good Endeavour, he considers Esther placed in that palace by God for a particular moment, and he applies that to our workplace, and he reflects that you too might be placed there for a moment, a particular moment in time where you need to say something, where you need to speak. And Keller writes, if at that moment you're unwilling to risk your place in the palace for your neighbours, the palace owns you. Do not conform to the patterns of this world, even if it costs. And posture number 4 is separation. 2 Corinthians 6:17, therefore come out from them and be separate. And non-conformity may, on the rare occasion, mean we need to leave an organisation. But that's what Cameron in his book calls an emergency condition. It's not the normal pattern in the New Testament. The normal pattern in the New Testament is that we are involved in the world around us. We're involved in a variety of different workplaces and organisations, cooperating, subverting, at times exposing, and on very rare occasions separating. Friends, I find that framework so helpful. It comes from a mind, not my mind, but a mind that I think is being renewed. That's why Paul says in these verses we need a renewed mind to know, how do I push back and when? What does it look like in practice in my particular organisation to not conform? But these verses in Romans, they hint at something else, don't they, to aid us. Paul begins with the words, you see the first words there, I urge you, brothers and sisters. Paul in these verses, he addresses a community. He addresses them corporately and he says, together, don't conform. And so the second thing we really need to aid our non-conformity is the support of each other. You know this, and I've mentioned it already, but it takes great courage to not conform. It really does. When you're the only one, or feel like you're the only one. But you're not the only one. Look around here this morning, you're not the only one. So you need to remind yourself that you're not the only one, and not feel like you're going at it alone in seeking to not conform. But you need other Christians around you to encourage them in this, because they need your encouragement, but also to be encouraged by them in turn in this. So make it a habit of talking with brothers and sisters about your work, and really that's one of the things that City Bible Forum just absolutely wants to help you in here in the city. One of the things that our prayer teams do is they pray about our workplaces, they pray for our colleagues, and they become a space. I've experienced this numerous times. They have become a space where people have come along and said, I've just come from this in the office. I don't know what to do. I don't want to conform. But what's it going to take in this moment to not conform? And they become a great space for that as well. If we can help you and assist you and aid you in that way, in any way, in having the support and the encouragement of one another in that, then we're more than happy to help. You know what sometimes that you find happens in the office when you do act courageously? You find that others in the workplace who might not even be Christian actually go along with you. They too haven't felt particularly comfortable with a certain practice. But you're the one in that office who has the courage of your convictions to stand up, to speak up. And you find that in that moment, you thought you were the only one, but you might well become a leader in that workplace, in that organisation for others who feel the same, but haven't had the courage to say so. Let me close with a brief story, one which I think brings together some of those strands of cooperation, subversion, exposure. A Christian man working in private equity, his team, they identified an excellent investment opportunity. Great return was looking likely for the company. However, as this Christian boss looked into it, the potential business that they were looking to invest in, it was legal. The company itself would have had absolutely no problem with investing in it. But as a Christian person, he felt uncomfortable. He thought this business, this industry, may well have done more harm to the community than good. And so he was torn, do I veto this investment at cost, potential financial cost to my team, to my company, our competitors get it? Or do I approve it, tell my team to pursue it, but then I'm going to be benefiting profiting from something I don't believe in. He went back to his team and he said to them, I want you to go ahead in pursuing this deal. But if it comes through, I personally won't participate in any bonus that we might receive. And he took that occasion as their team leader to explain to them why. Sharing with them something of his Christian faith, the concerns that he had about and the desire to do good to others and bless others. Well, the deal was approved, a big bonus was rewarded. That team in particular received a massive bonus. But true to his word, this man, he turned down his share of the profit. At a real cost to himself, probably a real financial cost to his family too. But that might be the cost of non-conformity. But don't we follow the one who did not come to be served, but to serve, and whose non-conformity cost him his life for you? And so, Paul writes, in view of that extravagant mercy, do not conform.